she whispered, "You'll freeze if you leave," then pulled the cowboy into her quilt of shame. The sky had turned an angry shade of gray by late afternoon, and the wind had begun to bite through the layers of clothing that Jake wore. He had been on the trail all day, herding cattle across the wide, snow-covered plains, and the blizzard that came so suddenly had caught him off guard. He had ridden hard since morning, but now the snow was falling so thickly that he could barely see 10 feet in front of him. Each step of his horse felt heavier as the ground grew slick with ice. The world had become a swirl of white, with the horizon disappearing into the endless storm. Jake was no stranger to harsh winters. He had grown up on the plains and knew the dangers of cold nights. Still, this storm was different. It had come faster than anyone could expect, and now he found himself far from the nearest settlement. The wind whistled through the trees like a warning, and the snow crunched sharply under the hooves of his horse. He wrapped his scarf tighter around his neck and pulled his coat closer, trying to hold in whatever warmth he could. Every now and then he could feel the cold biting through his gloves, and the tips of his fingers were starting to sting. The cattle drive had been long, and Jake had been alone for most of it. He loved the solitude, the way the land seemed endless and free. But right now, that solitude felt like isolation. The sun had already begun to dip below the horizon, and shadows stretched across the snow, making the landscape look strange and unfamiliar. He urged his horse forward, knowing he had to find shelter soon. Even a small cabin or shed would do, somewhere to rest, warm up, and wait for the storm to pass. After what felt like hours of riding through the blinding snow, Jake spotted a faint outline through the storm. At first, he wasn't sure what it was, but as he drew closer, he realized it was a cabin, small and sturdy, with smoke curling from its chimney. Relief washed over him like a warm wave. He had been pushing himself and his horse to the limit, and the thought of a fire, a roof over his head, and a chance to sit down for a while made him feel almost human again. He guided his horse carefully through the drifts of snow, each step a struggle, until they reached the cabin door. Jake knocked gently, but no sound came back to him through the blizzard. He knocked again, a little louder this time, hoping someone was inside. The door creaked open slightly, and a shadow appeared. A woman stepped into the doorway. She was tall, with sharp eyes that seemed to look right through him, and her face was lined with years of living alone in the harsh land. Her hair, streaked with silver, was tucked neatly under a scarf, and her coat was thick and worn from years of use. "Who's there?" she called, her voice firm but calm. The wind whipped around them, making her words almost impossible to hear. "Name's Jake," he said, raising his voice so she could hear him. "I've been caught in the storm. Please."
"I need shelter." He tried to sound confident, but his teeth were chattering and he could feel his hands trembling.
The woman studied him for a long moment. She didn't immediately invite him in. Instead, she crossed her arms and her eyes narrowed as she looked at him from head to toe. He could feel her suspicion, but he also noticed a glimmer of concern in her gaze. It was clear she was used to strangers, to people coming and going, but she had also learned to be cautious in a world that could be unforgiving. "You'll freeze out there if you don't come in," she said finally, her voice softer now. "Step inside. Quickly." Jake didn't need another invitation. He guided his horse to a post near the cabin, tying it carefully to make sure it wouldn't wander off. The snow had already started to cover the ground around them, and the wind tugged at his coat like it wanted to pull him back outside. Once inside, he felt an immediate warmth that made his frozen limbs sigh in relief. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and something homey, like bread or stew, though the smell was faint. The fire in the hearth crackled, sending sparks dancing up the chimney, and the room was small but cozy. He removed his gloves and coat, trying to let his body absorb the warmth. His fingers were red and stiff, but they would recover with time. The woman watched him carefully, as though she were deciding whether he was worthy of her trust. Jake could feel her eyes on him, but instead of feeling uncomfortable, he felt a strange sense of safety. There was something in her demeanor that said she had seen the world in all its cruelty, but she still chose to care when she could. Thank you, he said finally, his voice low. I didn't expect to find anyone out here. She gave a small nod, but didn't smile. No one plans for a blizzard like this. You were lucky, arriving when you did. She moved past him, fetching a thick blanket from a chair. She held it out to him, and he took it with a grateful hand. The quilt was worn but clean, patched in places where years of use had left their mark. Wrap yourself in this, she said. It'll keep you warm until you can rest. Jake hesitated for a moment, unsure if he was allowed to take it. The way she said quilt and the way she offered it made him feel like it was more than just a blanket. It was a symbol of protection, of care extended to someone in need. He accepted it and draped it over his shoulders, feeling the fabric settle around him like a warm embrace. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the storm outside. The wind rattled the windows, and the snow pressed against the cabin walls like it wanted to come inside. Jake could hear his own breathing, slow and uneven, and the crackle of the fire seemed to fill the room with life. The woman, whose name he would soon learn was Clara, finally sat down across from him. You're far from home, she said, after a while, her voice calm. Where exactly were you headed? Jake leaned back, feeling the heat from the fire seep into his frozen muscles. My ranch is several miles east. I was herding cattle, and the storm hit before I could get back. He paused, watching her reaction. I didn't think I'd make it without shelter. Clara nodded slowly. Many wouldn't. The winter is merciless if you're unprepared. You were smart to find a place to wait it out. They fell into a quiet rhythm, the storm outside acting as a backdrop to their brief but meaningful exchange. Jake felt the exhaustion of the day pressing against him, but he also felt a small spark of relief and gratitude. Here was someone who had seen him at his weakest, yet had chosen to help. It was a rare thing in a world that often demanded toughness above all else. As the evening wore on, Jake realized that staying here was more than just escaping the storm. It was a lesson in humility, in understanding that even the strongest and most independent people sometimes needed help. Clara had offered it without question, and in doing so, had reminded him of the quiet strength of human kindness. By the time the fire burned low and the storm began to lose some of its fury, Jake felt almost human again. He could move his fingers without pain, and the chill that had once made him shiver was slowly retreating. He knew he would eventually have to leave, return to his ranch, and face the challenges of winter once more. But for now, he allowed himself to rest. He looked at Clara and realized that the world was not entirely harsh. There were still people who cared, who understood the value of compassion. And sometimes, all it took was one warm quilt, one welcoming cabin, to remind a weary traveler that even in the coldest of winters, there was warmth to be found. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside the cabin, there was peace. Jake wrapped himself tighter in the quilt, feeling both the warmth of the fire and the quiet comfort of human care. For the first time that day, he felt safe, and for a moment, he allowed himself to forget the cold, the snow, and the long ride ahead. Jake had been sitting near the fire for a while, wrapped in the thick quilt that Clara had handed him, and slowly he began to feel some of the chill fade from his body. The warmth of the fire, mixed with the softness of the blanket, was enough to make him believe, for a brief moment, that he could forget the blizzard raging outside. His horse, tied safely outside the cabin, stamped its hooves in the snow, impatient but unharmed, and he knew that soon he would have to check on it. Yet, for now, he allowed himself to simply breathe. Clara had returned to her seat across from him, watching him with a calm, steady gaze. She had lived alone on this land for many years, and had become skilled at reading people. Something about Jake made her pause. He was young, but weathered by life already. His face carried both determination and exhaustion, a combination she recognized from her own younger years. He had the quiet strength of someone who worked with his hands and his mind, someone who had faced hardship before and survived. "You've been on the trail a long time," Clara said, breaking the silence. "You need more than just warmth. You need food. Come, sit closer to the fire, and I'll bring you something to eat." Jake hesitated for only a moment, then moved closer. The cabin was small, filled with the faint scent of wood smoke, dried herbs, and the faintest trace of flour from baking. He noticed the careful arrangement of the furniture, the way each item had its place, and realized that this was a home that had been tended for years. There was a quiet order here, the kind of order that only came from someone who had learned to depend on herself. Clara returned with a simple meal, a bowl of steaming soup, bread that had been freshly baked that morning, and a small cup of warm tea. She set it in front of him, and the warmth rising from the food made his stomach growl in spite of himself. He had been too preoccupied with the storm and the cold to notice how hungry he had become. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I didn't expect a warm meal tonight." Clara shrugged lightly. "It's nothing special, just something to help a weary traveler. You do the same for someone else, I hope." Jake smiled faintly, though he was still tired. "I hope so. I've been out here long enough to know how important it is to help when you can." He took a careful sip of the soup, feeling the warmth spread through his body. Each spoonful seemed to bring him back to life, melting away the last of the cold that had settled deep in his bones. They ate in silence for a few minutes, each listening to the other and to the storm outside. The wind rattled the cabin walls and the snow pressed against the windows, but inside, it was peaceful. Jake found himself studying Clara without meaning to. She moved with quiet confidence, carrying herself with the ease of someone who had faced hardship alone for many years. Her hands, though gentle now as she stirred her own cup of tea, were strong and capable, hands that could chop wood, mend fences, and survive in a world that demanded resilience. After finishing the meal, Jake leaned back and let out a long sigh. "I don't know how I would have made it through this night without finding this cabin. I've faced many storms, but this one, it nearly got the better of me." Clara nodded. "The winter can be unforgiving. It doesn't matter how strong or experienced you are, it always demands respect. You were lucky to arrive here when you did." "I guess I was," Jake admitted. "But luck isn't always on your side. You've got to work hard for it, too. And sometimes—" He paused, looking at the fire. "Sometimes you need help from someone you don't even know." Clara considered his words carefully. She understood exactly what he meant. She herself had learned this lesson years ago after losing her husband and having to manage the ranch alone. There were nights when she had been too tired to continue, when the cold had seemed too much to bear and someone had shown up to lend a hand. It was those small acts of kindness that had reminded her that the world was not entirely cruel, that people could still care. "You've had a long day," she said softly. "You need rest. You can sleep in the guest room tonight. The quilt you have will keep you warm." Jake hesitated, unsure if he was imposing. "I don't want to be a burden. I can just sleep in the corner and leave early in the morning." Clara shook her head. "You're not a burden. Everyone needs help sometimes. That's why I keep this cabin open, to help those who find themselves in need." He nodded slowly, appreciating her words more than he could say. There was a comfort in knowing that someone cared enough to offer shelter, warmth, and food without expecting anything in return. He had learned the hard way that life on the plains could be harsh, and moments of genuine kindness were rare. He would remember this night for the rest of his life. After the meal, Jake helped Clara with small chores around the cabin. He stoked the fire, making sure it would burn through the night, and checked the horse outside to ensure it was secure and comfortable. Clara moved quietly around the cabin, attending to her own tasks. They worked side by side in a silence that felt natural and easy, the kind of silence that comes from shared understanding. The storm continued outside, but inside, the cabin felt like a world apart, safe and warm. As the night grew deeper, Clara finally suggested that they sit by the fire and talk. She wanted to know more about him, and he wanted to know more about her. They shared stories of their past, small moments that revealed their character without needing to boast or impress. Jake spoke of life on the ranch, of long days under the sun, of the freedom he felt while working with the cattle. Clara spoke of her own life, of managing the land alone, and of the lessons she had learned about patience, resilience, and compassion. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by the crackle of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. Jake felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in months. Here in this small cabin, he could let down his guard. He could be tired, cold, and human without having to prove anything. Clara listened to him, not judging, simply sharing her own experiences when appropriate, creating a bond built on trust and understanding. Time passed quickly, and before long the storm began to lose some of its fury. The wind still howled outside, but it no longer seemed as threatening. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white, but inside the cabin the warmth of the fire and the comfort of companionship made the long night feel shorter. Eventually, Jake realized that he was ready to sleep. Clara led him to the guest room, a small space with a simple bed covered in another quilt. He settled in, pulling the quilt over himself, and felt the exhaustion of the day finally catch up with him. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to close his eyes without fear. The warmth of the cabin, the kindness of Clara, and the safety of shelter surrounded him like a protective embrace. Before drifting off, he thought about the storm outside and how easily it could have ended his journey if he hadn't found the cabin. He thought about the people in the world, like Clara, who were willing to offer help to strangers in need. And he realized that even in the harshest conditions, there were moments of humanity that could warm the coldest night. Clara, in her own room, reflected on the encounter as well. She had seen many travelers in her time, but there was something different about Jake. He was respectful, hard-working, and genuinely grateful. Helping him reminded her of her own strength and the quiet power of kindness. She knew that when he left in the morning, the memory of this night would stay with him, just as it would stay with her. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless march across the plains, but inside the cabin, peace reigned. Two people, strangers until that evening, had found warmth, safety, and a shared understanding that would not soon be forgotten. And as Jake drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, the cabin seemed to hum with the quiet satisfaction of having done the right thing in a world that could be cold and unforgiving. Morning did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, quietly, as if the land itself was tired after fighting the storm all night. Pale light slipped through the small cabin window, touching the wooden floor and the edges of the furniture. Outside, the wind had softened, no longer screaming like it had the night before. Snow still covered everything, thick and heavy, but the storm had lost its anger. Jake woke up slowly. For a moment he forgot where he was. The bed was warmer than he expected, and the quilt felt heavy but comforting. Then memories returned. The blizzard, the long ride, the cabin, and Clara. He sat up carefully, stretching his arms and legs. His body ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that came after surviving something difficult. He stood and looked out the window. The world outside was quiet and white, like it had been wiped clean. His horse was still tied near the cabin, moving slowly but safely. Relief washed over him. He had worried about the animal all night, even in his sleep. The smell of something warm drifted through the air. Jake followed it to the main room, where Clara was already awake. She stood near the stove, stirring a pot with steady hands. The fire was burning again, strong and bright. "You're awake," she said without turning around. "Good. Breakfast will be ready soon."
"Morning!"
Jake replied, his voice calm but grateful. "I slept better than I have in a long time." Clara nodded. Storm nights have a way of exhausting people. "Sit down. You'll need the strength today." Jake sat at the small wooden table. He noticed how the cabin looked different in daylight. Everything was simple but cared for. There were no extra things, no waste. Each item had a purpose. It reminded him of ranch life, where you learned to respect what you had because nothing came easy. Clara placed a plate in front of him. Warm bread, eggs, and a cup of tea. Nothing fancy, but it felt like a gift. "Thank you," Jake said again. He felt like the word was too small for everything she had done, but it was all he had. They ate quietly at first. The silence was comfortable now, no longer heavy or uncertain. Outside, the snow reflected light back into the room, making everything feel brighter. After a while, Clara spoke. "The storm will leave deep snow behind. Travel won't be easy today." Jake nodded. "I know. I won't rush. I'll wait until the path is clear enough." "That's wise," she said. "Many people make mistakes when they hurry after a storm." Jake smiled slightly. "I've made enough mistakes to last a lifetime." Clara looked at him, curious. "You learn from them?" "I try to," he said. "Sometimes learning hurts." She understood that. She had learned many lessons the hard way herself. Life had not been gentle with her, especially after her husband passed away years ago. Running the land alone had tested her strength, her patience, and her faith in people. After breakfast, Jake insisted on helping with chores. Clara didn't argue. She handed him an axe, and together they stepped outside. The cold was sharp but manageable now. The sky was clear, and the sun hovered low, casting long shadows across the snow. Jake chopped wood while Clara cleared a path near the door. They worked side by side, speaking only when needed. There was a quiet rhythm between them, an understanding that didn't need many words. As Jake swung the axe, he thought about how close he had come to real danger. One wrong turn, one more hour in the storm, and things could have ended very differently. Clara watched him work. He didn't complain, didn't rush. He respected the task. That told her a lot about the kind of man he was. Later, they returned inside to warm up. Jake checked on his horse again, brushing snow from its back and giving it water. He spoke to it softly, the way someone speaks to a trusted companion. Clara noticed. She liked that. When they sat by the fire again, the mood shifted. It was no longer about survival. It was about reflection. "You don't talk much about yourself," Clara said gently. Jake stared at the fire for a moment. "There's not much to tell. I grew up on a ranch not far from here. Lost my parents young. Learn to work early. The land became my teacher.
That's more than most people, she replied. Maybe, he said.
But sometimes it feels lonely. Clara didn't answer right away. She understood loneliness too well. The nights were long when you lived alone. The silence could feel louder than any storm. You get used to it, she finally said. But that doesn't mean it stops being hard. Jake looked at her, then really looked at her. He saw strength in her eyes, but also something softer. Someone who had endured, not because she wanted to be alone, but because she had to be. I'm glad I found this place, he said quietly. Not just because of the storm. Clara gave a small smile. Sometimes people arrive when they are meant to. The day moved on slowly. They talked more, sharing small memories, small thoughts. Nothing dramatic, nothing heavy. Just pieces of life passed gently from one person to another. By afternoon, the sky began to change. Clouds gathered again, though not with the same threat as before. Jake knew it was time to think about leaving soon, before night returned. He felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, relief, and something else, something harder to name. This place, this quiet kindness, had touched him more deeply than he expected. Clara felt it too. She had opened her door to many travelers over the years, but few stayed in her thoughts like this one would. Jake reminded her that even after loss, life could still surprise you. As Jake prepared his things, he folded the quilt carefully and placed it back where it belonged. "Thank you," he said again, "for everything." Clara nodded. "You're welcome. Just remember what this night taught you." "I will," he said honestly. Outside, the snow crunched under his boots. He mounted his horse slowly, looking back at the cabin one last time. Smoke still rose from the chimney, steady and warm. Clara stood in the doorway, watching him go. The storm had passed, but its lesson remained. Sometimes, survival wasn't just about strength. Sometimes, it was about accepting kindness when it was offered. And sometimes, a single night could change how a person saw the world. The morning after the blizzard was quiet but full of energy in a different way. The storm had moved on, leaving thick snow and sparkling frost across the land. Sunlight reflected off the white fields, turning the snow into a dazzling sea of brightness. Jake could see for miles now, the horizon clear and calm, and it reminded him how dangerous the night before had been. The blizzard had tested him, his horse, and every bit of his strength, but it had also shown him something he hadn't expected: kindness. Clara was already awake when he went downstairs. The cabin smelled warm and inviting, the fire crackling in the hearth and a pot of tea steaming gently on the stove. She looked up as he entered, and her expression held that familiar mix of calm curiosity and quiet understanding. "Good morning," she said simply. "Morning," Jake replied, smiling faintly. "I didn't sleep well at first, but the bed and quilt really helped." "Thank you." Clara waved her thanks away. "You need rest to recover from yesterday. A cold night can take more out of a man than a long ride sometimes." They shared breakfast together, quiet but comfortable. The wind outside was gentle now, whispering through the trees instead of howling, and the sun made the snow glint like thousands of tiny diamonds. It was beautiful, but Jake knew the cold was still strong, hiding under the snow, and he would need energy to continue his journey. After eating, Jake offered to help Clara with chores around the cabin. She hesitated for a moment, as she usually did with strangers, but then nodded. There was something in his quiet determination that reminded her of people she could trust.
"Wood needs chopping," she said.
"The stove will need fuel, and you might as well get used to working before heading back out into the snow." Jake picked up the axe and went outside. The snow crunched under his boots, and the cold air filled his lungs. He could see the small barn in the distance, the horse's head poking out of the door, and the tools neatly lined up by the cabin. Clara handed him the first log. "Start with this," she said, and then moved to sweep the snow near the porch. Chopping wood was hard work, but it felt good. The physical effort warmed him quickly, and it reminded him of life on the ranch. Long days, hard work, and small rewards. Sweat mixed with the cold air, and his fingers moved with a steady rhythm, each swing of the axe purposeful. He felt alive, alert, and useful. Clara worked alongside him, moving quickly to clear snow and stack the logs near the cabin. She didn't speak much at first, letting the work itself create a rhythm between them. There was a strange comfort in this silent teamwork. It reminded Jake of the days when ranch work had been shared, the long hours made lighter by companionship, even if words were few. When they paused for a moment to rest, Jake looked at Clara. "You've lived here a long time, haven't you?" She nodded. "Most of my life. This land has been my home, my responsibility. I've learned that if you respect it, it gives you what you need. If you don't, it can be cruel." Jake understood that perfectly. He had felt the same truth on the plains, on the cattle drives, and even during the storm the night before. Life demanded respect, patience, and hard work. He nodded. "I've learned the same thing, though sometimes I forget." They resumed their work, stacking the wood neatly, moving with a quiet efficiency. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the light grew warmer, but the snow still sparkled with frost. Jake could feel the hours passing, yet it didn't feel tiring in the same way as riding through a blizzard. This work, this quiet cooperation, had a different kind of strength. Later, they returned to the cabin to check on the horse and to warm up by the fire. The animal was calm and well fed, and Jake felt a sense of relief and satisfaction. He had worried about it all night, and now it was safe, warm, and content. He brushed the snow from its coat, speaking softly as he always did. The horse whinnied in response, a sound of trust and comfort. Inside, the cabin was cozy. Jake moved to the fire, warming his hands, and Clara went about tidying the small space. The quiet routine gave them both time to think. Jake realized that this night and morning had changed something in him. The storm, the cold, and the fear had been real, but so had the kindness and calmness of the cabin. It was a balance that made life feel more manageable. After the chores, they sat together, sipping tea. Clara studied Jake carefully. "You're not like other travelers," she said finally. "Most come and go. They are in a hurry, and they don't notice anything beyond their own needs." Jake thought for a moment before answering. "Maybe it's because I know what it's like to be caught in trouble. You learn to pay attention, not just to yourself, but to others too. You learn that help can come when you least expect it." Clara smiled faintly. "You've learned well." They talked quietly for a long time, sharing small stories of life on the land. Jake spoke of his family, the ranch, and his daily struggles. Clara shared memories of her husband, of running the cabin alone, and of the lessons she had learned about resilience, patience, and human kindness. There were moments of laughter when they recalled funny incidents, and moments of quiet reflection when they spoke of losses and hardships. Through the conversation, Jake realized that this was more than just a lesson in survival. It was a lesson in humanity. He had faced the storm and lived, but what he would remember most was the care he had received. It reminded him that strength alone was not enough in life. Kindness, empathy, and understanding mattered too. As the afternoon wore on, Clara suggested they prepare for the next part of his journey. The snow, though less threatening, still covered the ground heavily. He would need energy, supplies, and preparation to continue safely. She helped him pack, offering advice about where the snow would be deeper and which paths might be difficult. "You need to take your time," she said. "There's no shame in waiting for the right moment. Rushing only brings danger." Jake nodded. "I'll follow your advice. I want to get back safely, not fast." Before he left, Clara handed him the quilt he had used the night before. "Take this with you," she said. "It's warm and sturdy. It will help if the weather turns again." Jake accepted it gratefully, folding it carefully and placing it over his shoulder. "Thank you," he said, again trying to convey all the gratitude in a single phrase. Clara watched as he prepared to leave. The sun had moved lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. She could see the determination in him, but also the care he had for life around him, the horse, the land, and even the quiet routines of the cabin. "Take care, Jake," she said, "and remember what this night and morning taught you. Life is harsh, but it is also full of people willing to help, if you notice them." "I will," he promised. "I won't forget." As he mounted his horse and started toward the horizon, he looked back at the cabin one last time. Smoke still curled from the chimney, the roof dusted with fresh snow, and Clara stood at the door, a quiet figure against the sparkling white. It was more than a memory. It was a lesson in resilience, kindness, and quiet strength. Jake rode slowly, letting the snow crunch beneath his horse's hooves. He knew the journey ahead would not be easy. There would be cold nights, long days, and the usual struggles of life on the plains. But he also carried with him something stronger than fear or worry: the memory of kindness, the warmth of the cabin, and the quiet lessons he had learned from Clara. It was a lesson that would last far beyond the winter, a lesson that reminded him that even in the harshest times, human compassion could make the world brighter, and sometimes that warmth was stronger than any fire, any coat, or even the sun itself. The morning after Jake left the cabin, the world seemed different. The blizzard had fully passed, leaving a silent landscape of snow-covered fields and glistening trees. The sky was a soft blue, and sunlight reflected off the snow in a way that made everything look fresh, new, and peaceful. Jake rode slowly, letting his horse move steadily through the thick snow, each step deliberate and careful. The ground was uneven, hidden beneath a blanket of white, but he felt prepared, confident, and even grateful for the experience he had lived through. As he rode, Jake thought back to the cabin, to Clara, and to the warmth of the fire that had saved him from the bitter cold. The night in the blizzard had been frightening, exhausting, and yet, somehow, it had changed him. He realized that survival was not only about strength and skill, it was about noticing the small acts of kindness that made life bearable. The quilt Clara had given him, the food, the fire, and her quiet words of advice, they were not just gestures, they were lessons in humanity. The journey back to his ranch was slow, but Jake welcomed it. He had the time to look around and appreciate the beauty of the land. The snow glistened like crystals, the trees were heavy with frost, and the hills rolled gently beneath the white blanket. For the first time in a long while, he felt calm. The blizzard had tested him, but now the land seemed peaceful, almost welcoming. Halfway through his ride, Jake paused near a small creek that had partially frozen overnight. The water still ran in some places, clear and bright, reflecting the sunlight. He let his horse drink, bending close to the icy surface and watching the water move slowly. He thought about how life moved in similar ways. Even when things seemed frozen or difficult, there was always a path forward, always movement, always hope. Jake also thought about Clara. She had lived through harsh winters alone, yet she had not hardened her heart. Instead, she had offered warmth, safety, and guidance to a stranger. That was a rare strength, he realized. Many people survived harsh conditions, but few did so while keeping their hearts open. He felt lucky not only to have found shelter, but also to have met someone who reminded him of the good in the world. As the day wore on, the snow began to soften, making the ground easier for his horse to navigate. Jake felt lighter with each mile. His thoughts were calm, reflective, and grateful. He thought about the lessons he had learned in the cabin: patience, humility, and the quiet power of kindness. They were lessons he could carry not just through the winter, but through life itself. When Jake finally saw the familiar outline of his ranch in the distance, he felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction. The long ride, the storm, the night in the cabin, all of it had tested him. He knew he was stronger now, not just physically, but in heart and mind. The cattle were grazing quietly in the snow-covered pastures, and the barn stood solid and welcoming. Everything looked familiar, yet somehow the experience of the last 2 days had changed how he saw it. The land was no longer just a place to work. It was a place that demanded respect, care, and awareness of the life it supported. He guided his horse into the barn, brushing off snow and checking the harnesses. The animal had worked hard alongside him and deserved rest. Jake smiled at it, whispering a few kind words, and felt the bond between them deepen. This was another lesson he had carried from the cabin. Attention and care could make even the hardest work feel meaningful. After tending to the horse, Jake walked to the main house. The warmth of the ranch, the familiar smells, and the quiet sounds of life filled him with comfort. Yet, he noticed something within himself had shifted. He was more aware, more grateful, and more thoughtful. The storm and the kindness of a stranger had shown him that even small acts of care could create lasting impacts. He spent the afternoon checking on the cattle, repairing fences where the snow had piled too high, and clearing pathways to make the ranch safe. The work was hard, but it felt different now. It was no longer just survival. It was care, responsibility, and connection. He thought about Clara again, and how she had handled her own land and life with quiet strength. He realized that people like her existed not for recognition, but because they understood that kindness and resilience mattered as much as skill and determination. As evening approached, Jake built a small fire outside the ranch house, watching the last sunlight reflect off the snow. The sky was painted in soft oranges and pinks, and he felt a deep sense of peace. He remembered the warmth of Clara's cabin, the smell of the fire, the quilt, and the gentle conversation. It had been more than a night of survival. It had been a lesson in trust, compassion, and human connection. That night, he wrote in his journal, something he did rarely but found meaningful after the storm. He wrote about the blizzard, the fear he had felt, the exhaustion, and then the comfort of finding the cabin. He wrote about Clara, her quiet strength, her patience, and the way she had taught him that kindness could be as important as courage. As he finished, he looked up at the stars, clear and bright after the storm. He thought about how vast the world was, how unpredictable, and yet how moments of care could shine even in the harshest conditions. It was a lesson he would never forget. The memory of the cabin, the warmth, and the kindness would stay with him, guiding him through every cold night, every difficult day, and every challenge ahead. The next morning, Jake decided to visit Clara's cabin again. He wanted to thank her properly and to share some of the supplies he had brought from the ranch, a small gift of gratitude. The path was easier now, the snow packed down, and his horse moved with steady confidence. As he approached the cabin, he saw smoke rising gently from the chimney. Clara was outside, stacking wood, her movements calm and steady. "Jake," she called when she saw him. "Back so soon?" "I wanted to thank you properly," he said. "For everything." You saved more than just my life. You reminded me what people can do for each other." Clara smiled softly. "You're welcome. I don't expect thanks. But I'm glad you learned something from this." Jake handed her a small bundle of supplies, food, blankets, and a few extra tools. "It's a little something from my ranch. You helped me. I want to help you too." Clara accepted it with a nod. "That's very thoughtful. It will be useful." They stood together for a moment, watching the quiet land, the sparkling snow, and the calm after the storm. It was a moment of connection, of shared understanding, and of respect for what they had both endured. Neither spoke for a while, but the silence was comfortable. It was a silence that spoke of trust, gratitude, and the quiet human strength that often went unnoticed. Finally, Jake mounted his horse, ready to continue his journey back home. "I should go now," he said. Clara nodded. "Take care, Jake. Remember what you've learned, and pass it on whenever you can." "I will," he promised. "And I won't forget this night or your kindness." He rode slowly, letting the wind guide him gently across the fields. The snow sparkled under the sun, and the land seemed alive in a way it hadn't before. He felt strong, grateful, and at peace. He knew that storms would come again, as they always did. But he also knew that kindness, patience, and courage could carry him through anything. When he finally arrived at his ranch, Jake felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The cattle were safe, the fences repaired, and the land was quiet and ready for the winter ahead. He felt a connection to the world that he hadn't noticed before. It was more than survival. It was life, shared, cared for, and respected. As night fell, Jake sat by the fire reflecting on the events of the past 2 days. The blizzard, the cabin, Clara, and the lessons he had learned. They were all a part of him now. He realized that life was not just about facing storms, but also about noticing the people and moments that brought warmth and meaning. And as he drifted to sleep, the memory of the cabin, the fire, the quilt, and the quiet strength of Clara stayed with him. It was a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, human kindness and care could make the world brighter, safer, and more hopeful. Jake had survived the storm, but he had gained more than warmth and safety. He had gained perspective, understanding, and the quiet knowledge that small acts of care could change a person's life forever.